The Southern Qiang Kingdom was shattered, and the once towering Crown Prince Xiao Ye fell into the mortal mud. It was rumored that he was imprisoned by the most brutal princess of Northern Yen, and was subjected to daily humiliation until his confidants rescued him before he was finally released. Shen Yuan looked coldly at the man leisurely pouring tea in front of him and asked, "If you miss tonight, it will be difficult for you to escape the city again." "Do you know Xiao Ye?" "I know." Shen Yuan frowned and grabbed his neck, forcing him to lift his head. "So, won't you take revenge? Does the princess want me to report or not?" Shen Yuan awkwardly withdrew his hand and said, "I teach you horse riding, archery, and martial arts, hoping that you can use them where you need them." That night, the guards of the Northern Yen Palace reported that the Southern Qiang son.In.Law of Shen Yuan's mansion had fled the city and supported himself in the south, becoming at odds with his own wife. Later, over a month later, Shen Yuan launched a mutiny and personally killed his biological father, plotting to seize the throne and establish himself as king. At the end of the Xiangjiang RiverXiao Ye looked at Shen Yuan wearing a dragon robe and asked, "Now that your wish has been fulfilled, my son.In.Law has no place to be useful, right?" Shen Yuan said, "I am the new king, so the old imperial consort was naturally useless." Just as Xiao Ye was lost, her tone changed. In the old days, the imperial consort was useless, but the imperial throne was vacant. In the second year of the Xuanguo reign, the remaining forces of the Southern Qiang people surrendered, and the empress married, reclaiming the territory of the Southern Qiang people and establishing a new national name. The Empress and Empress ruled together. Chapter 1. Do you want to die? You are listening at Novel Full.Audio. The wild wind is raging. The first snowfall in Zhuzhou City was heavy and urgent, but in just half an hour, a thin layer of frost and snow covered the animal training ground in the suburbs of Beijing. "Your Highness, run quickly. Leave me alone." Xiao Ye's clothes were torn by the black bear, and there were 3 visible scratches on his chest. He turned his head cautiously and looked around, while holding on to Li Sun's hand. "Don't worry, I'll pull you out now." Under Li Sun's feet was a trap full of sharp knives, and as soon as Xiao Ye let go, those sharp knives would pierce through his body. At the same time, a rapid sound of horse hooves came from the back of the two. Li Sun closed his eyes in despair, and Xiao Ye noticed something. Just as he wanted to stop, his eyes were covered in splashing blood. The weight of his subordinates became lighter, and he gasped for breath. He lowered his head and looked down. Li Sun's broken body was pierced by a sharp knife, and his right sleeve was empty, while he was holding the broken half of his arm. Xiao Ye's brain was a bit confused, and before he could react, a black shadow jumped over the trap with a roar and pressed him straight into the soil. The bones on his shoulders seemed to be shattered, and the cold wind penetrated his throat, constantly tearing at Xiao Ye's collapsed nerves. He gritted his teeth and raised his eyes, staring intently at the beast on his body that was ready to bite him at any moment. The black bear was provoked by his fierce gaze, and he looked up and roared angrily. In that moment, a feather arrow wrapped in gold wire suddenly broke through the wind and penetrated the black bear's huge head. The huge object on his body suddenly collapsed to the ground, and Xiao Ye didn't care about being happy. He immediately clenched the short knife in his waist and stared at the newcomer intently. Shen Yuan, dressed in a fiery red robe, rode a high-headed red golden ink horse and rushed to Xiao Ye, giving him a commanding glance. Her gaze was contemptuous and haughty, as if disdaining a lowly ant. 100 Qiang slaves, I didn't expect you to live to the end. It's really boring. Xiao Ye clenched his 5 fingers, holding a short knife, and leaped up in the howling cold wind, heading straight towards Shen Yuan's life gate. His desperate attack fell into Shen Yuan's eyes like a wild cat with bright claws, making people laugh. I saw her long bow hanging in her hand, pulling and tugging, and Xiao Ye's short knife was instantly thrown away. He himself was also mercilessly hit by Shen Yuan's palm and flew several meters away. Shen Yuan's close attendant Zhang Yuan also chased after him with his men and horses at this moment. Princess. Shen Yuan withdrew his long bow and glanced coldly at the crowd rushing behind him. Take him back to the princess's mansion. Throughout the process, she didn't even give Xiao Ye a glance. Zhang Yuan listened to the command and turned to look over. When he saw that the last person alive was Xiao Ye, he instinctively frowned. Princess, these lowly Qiang slaves are really not worthy of staying at the princess's mansion to serve. It's better for me to find another place for him. Shen Yuan threw the long bow in his hand to the attendant beside him and gave Zhang Yuan a cold glance upon hearing the words. Looking for another place to go. Don't you forget that he was the son.In.Law appointed by the late emperor to this palace in his early years. Since he is a son.In.Law, he naturally has to live in the princess's mansion. Upon hearing Shen Yuan's words, Zhang Yuan couldn't help but feel slanderous inside. If you really take the engagement of the late emperor seriously, there wouldn't be today's animal training competition. The Southern Qiang have been destroyed by the Northern Yan, and Shen Yuan's claim that Xiao Ye is her son.In.Law will naturally not be taken seriously. Due to the unpredictable nature of his own princess, when Xiao Ye moved into the princess's mansion, the servants did not dare to really underestimate him. The courtyard where Xiao Ye lives is called the Selling Incense Courtyard, which is an extremely insulting name and is only one wall away from the Qinghua building where Shen Yuan lives. The distance between this wall is enough to showcase the abyss that cannot be crossed between the two. It is night, with sparse stars covering the clouds, and winter frost soaking the moon. The vocal music in the Qinghua building keeps going, but the incense sales courtyard separated by a wall is as cold as an ice cellar. In the huge room, there was not a candle for lighting. Moonlight crawled in through the window and was startled by the thin and frail figure on the big bed, causing his figure to tremble. Xiao Ye was curled up at the head of the bed with injuries all over his body. Shen Yuan only asked someone to bring him back, without giving any other orders. Servants dare not privately ask doctors to treat his injuries, and even dare not give him more food. He curled up at the head of the bed, counting carefully in his heart. His aunt told him that there is no such thing as a never-ending path. But Xiao Ye couldn't hold on and fainted. When he woke up the next day, he saw the doctor sitting by his bed flipping through medical books. Su Sheng was also happy to see him wake up and quickly put down his medical book to measure his pulse. The pulse seems to have some blood loss, but it's okay. After I prescribe a few pairs of medicine for you and take it for half a month, it will be great. As soon as Su Sheng finished speaking, he heard someone outside the door announcing the arrival of the princess, which frightened him. He quickly gathered his clothes and knelt down to bow. Grassroots pay their respects to the princess. Shen Yuan changed into a blue woven and complex golden silk peony palace dress today, with a green silk tied up in a stunning bun. She was both noble and elegant, but her cold and stunning face still exuded a haughty and arrogant demeanor. Let's all get up. Her voice is very calm, even sounding a bit cold. Xiao Ye stared at her without moving for a moment, and upon hearing this indifferent voice, he only felt it was appropriate. After all, a snake and scorpion woman like Shen Yuan is not worthy of anything warm, including her voice. Shen Yuan sat down in the chair and stool brought by the maid behind her, and saw that Xiao Ye was still staring at her. She immediately pulled the corners of her mouth in a wicked tone. Do you know what will happen if a man keeps staring at a woman in our northern Yan? Xiao Ye's throat still hurts, but he wants to speak. He asked, what will happen? Shen Yuan smiled and her cold and beautiful eyebrows and eyes instantly became charming. They will have their eyes gouged out and be thrown into the animal training ground to feed wild dogs. Xiao Ye also smiled along with her and withdrew his gaze without any sadness or joy, looking at the curtain above her head. Since that's the case, please kindly ask the princess to gouge out my eyes and throw them into the animal training ground to feed the wild dogs. The Southern Qiang people are gone, and he, the once high and mighty prince of the Southern Qiang people, is now serving as a prisoner. If possible, he would rather die than live under the clutches of his enemies with deep blood and hatred. Do you want to die? Shen Yuan stood up in front of the bed at some point, coldly gripping his chin and forcing him to look at him. You are the North Yen son.In.Law who has an engagement with this princess. Without my princess's orders, you'd better not even have the idea of dying. After saying these words, Shen Yuan shook off her hand and coldly instructed Su Sheng. Fix my princess's broken body. If it delays my princess wedding next month, I will ask you. Su Sheng responded with a trembling voice, until Shen Yuan walked out of the room and lifted his sleeve like a survivor, wiping the fine sweat off his forehead. Nowadays, no one in the entire northern Yen knows about Shen Yuan's brutality. This person has an unstable personality, and anyone who dares to oppose her, whether it be courtiers or nobles, will be executed without hesitation. Unfortunately, the current emperor is also very superstitious about fate, because when Shen Yuan was born, the national teacher said that her destiny could help northern Yen unify the 4 continents and quell the disputes among the 5 kingdoms. The emperor doted on this daughter in every way possible, whether she was killing or setting fire, or doing anything that angered everyone, he only turned a blind eye to her. Now that Shen Yuan is only 2 or 8 years old, the northern Yen has already recaptured the southern 3 kingdoms led by the Southern Qiang, leaving only the left Liang, and can achieve the great ambition of unifying the 4 continents and pacifying the 5 kingdoms. This is also why Shen Yuan took the children of the Southern Qiang royal family to the animal training ground to play and torture, which the current emperor only considers unseen. Chapter 2. Bird in the Cage. You are listening at novel full.audio. Su Sheng quickly ordered someone to boil Xiao Ye's medicine and bring it into the room, but he didn't expect that the crown prince had already been determined to die, and whatever he said would not work. Under great helplessness, Su Sheng had to ask someone to report to Shen Yuan, but only received a reply. If Xiao Ye doesn't want to drink medicine, send him to the largest male servant in the capital tonight. And Xiao Ye's temper was also fierce. As soon as Shen Yuan's words came back, he bit his tongue and committed suicide. Xiao Ye woke up here 3 days later. He had 2 more familiar attendants in his room, one of whom was the maid who brought him back from the animal training ground that day, Song Qinger. Shen Yuan sent these 2 people over because he was afraid of committing suicide. Actually, whether Xiao Ye died or lived had little impact on Shen Yuan, but recently the left Liang king has repeatedly proposed to his father, saying that he wants to marry his eldest son into northern Yen and become Shen Yuan's son.In.Law. The left Liang is different from the southern Qiang, as they have abundant troops, horses, and provisions. The more than 100,000 iron cavalry stationed in the border city alone is enough to make northern Yen headache. Although the Battle of Northern Yen and Southern Qiang ended with the defeat and surrender of the Southern Qiang, as the main fighting force, Northern Yen also consumed a considerable amount of military and financial resources. At present, it is not appropriate to have a conflict with the left Liang during the period of suspension and rectification of the war. When the civil and military officials of the Manchu dynasty saw this situation, they all advocated for her to marry the Grand Prince of the left Liang. They said it many times, and Shen Yuan found that even the previous efforts to protect her father's emperor were gradually beginning to waver. Shen Yuan is the eldest son of the left Liang king whom she has met before. Although his appearance is somewhat in line with her taste, he is not a good person just because of his practice of slaughtering his own brothers and seizing the position of eldest son. One is the Southern Qiang crown prince, who is weak and powerless to fight back, and the other is the left Liang Grand Prince, who has a deep mind and works step by step. Shen Yuan can still distinguish who is safer to keep by his side. The winter in Kyushu City is very cold. The frost and snow outside the window never stop, and there is no trace of green on the withered branches. Unlike the Southern Qiang, although it is cold in winter, there is less frost and snow, and evergreen green plants are everywhere. After waking up, Xiao Ye refused to eat or drink medicine. Shen Yuan heard the commotion and came to see him several times. No matter how much she tries to intimidate and entice, this person is unwilling to give in, and over time, her patience also runs out. On this day, the frost and snow rarely stopped outside. Shen Yuan led the guards out to hunt. He was lucky enough to hunt a red fox with red fur as soon as he entered the mountain. She watched as the fox was clever, and the feather arrows she shot did not harm its heart and lungs. So she asked the servants to bandage its wound and send it to the Incense Sales Institute where Xiao Ye was located. Qing'er looked at the red fox sent by the servant and was very happy. Where did this come from? Zhang Yuan glanced displeased at Xiao Ye sitting by the window. It wasn't because some people were so sentimental and kept eating and drinking all day that the princess was annoyed. It was only then that the princess saved this beast's life and made it stay in the incense sales courtyard to make others happy in the future. Qing'er was somewhat surprised when she heard these words, but more importantly, she felt happy for Xiao Ye. Xiao Gongzi, the princess is afraid that you will be lonely, so she specially sent you a red fox. Do you like it? Xiao Ye ignored her and stared blankly at the snow on the tree outside the window. Upon seeing this scene, Zhang Yuan's pent-up dissatisfaction finally erupted. He grabbed Xiao Ye's shoulder and was about to pull him to the ground. Hey! You didn't hear us talking to you, did you? You really treat yourself like... Before Zhang Yuanhua could finish speaking, Xiao Ye suddenly punched him in the lower abdomen. Do you dare to hit me? Zhang Yuan took 2 steps back in disbelief, covering his lower abdomen, staring at Xiao Ye half kneeling on the ground with a gloomy expression on his face. Don't think that if the princess saves your life, you will really treat yourself as a son.In.Law. Even if you are a lowly Chang slave and reincarnated 100 times, you are not worthy of our highness. After speaking, he pulled out his long whip from his waist and mercilessly swung Xiao Ye's 2 whips. Upon seeing this, Qing'er quickly rushed forward, and just then, the tightly closed door was kicked open from outside. Shen Yuan was still wearing a tight-sleeved hunting suit when going out for hunting. Her green hair was tied up high by her hair crown, revealing her smooth forehead. She looked a bit more handsome and confident in her noble demeanor. Zhang Yuan didn't expect Shen Yuan to suddenly come over, so he was so scared that he quickly knelt down to the ground. I have seen the princess. Shen Yuan lazily shook off the whip he was still holding in his hand, ignoring Zhang Yuan's guilty face. How about it? Do you still like the gift that this princess gave you? Xiao Ye was whipped twice on his back, his new injury tugged at his old injury, and soon his forehead was covered in cold sweat. Shen Yuan was not in a hurry either, lazily sitting in a nearby chair waiting for him to answer. Finally, Xiao Ye stood up from the ground with his weak arm strength. I won't take what you give me, let alone marry you. You've lost this heart. Shen Yuan chuckled lightly, but did not embarrass him. Since you don't like it, there's no need for it to live. Someone. Bring that beast to me, princess. Zhang Yuan quickly stood up and warmly escorted the red fox to Shen Yuan. Shen Yuan threw the whip in his hand onto the table, took out the personal bayonet tied to his boots, and opened the iron cage. The red fox in the cage sensed danger and kept pulling its injured calf inward. When it was caught by Shen Yuan, it screamed in shock. Xiao Ye listened to the mournful cry of the red fox, and his hands hanging on his side couldn't help but tighten slightly, but he still held back and didn't speak. Shen Yuan noticed his small movements and couldn't help but curl her lips slightly. This red fox skin is a rare and precious cloak collar to protect the neck, so peeling it off is much more meticulous than ordinary prey. Does Prince Xiao know how to quickly and stably peel off the entire red fox skin? Xiao Ye remained expressionless with a handsome face, while Shen Yuan grabbed the red fox's neck and forced it to lift its head tightly. She pressed the bayonet into the red fox's forehead and spoke coldly. Legend has it that the color of a red fox's fur changes with its emotions. The more it panics and feels pain, the darker its fur will become. Hair pickers usually start from their heads and tear open a wide opening, but they won't take their lives in a short period of time until their fur turns blood red due to the fear of death, and only then cut off their necks and take away their most valuable fur. Speaking, Shen Yuan was about to attack the forehead of the red fox. Wait. Xiao Ye's face turned pale and terrifying, staring fixedly at the red fox in Shen Yuan's hand. Give it to me. Shen Yuan sneered at him and said, don't you dislike it? What are you keeping it for? Xiao Ye's eyes were filled with boundless anger. It's a life, if I keep it, it can survive, so naturally I want to keep it. Shen Yuan chuckled and let go of his grip on the red fox, causing it to quickly flee behind Xiao Ye and hide. You can keep it if you want, but I have a few conditions. Xiao Ye still had anger in his eyes, but he gritted his teeth and spoke. You say. Chapter 3 Etiquette. Sending the son.In.Law into the bridal chamber. You are listening at novel full.audio. Shen Yuan said, from now on, you must drink your medicine on time every day and eat your meals on time. 2. Do not commit suicide again. If you dare to commit suicide, you may not die, but the fox behind you will definitely die. 3. On the day of our wedding, you are not allowed to act recklessly. If you dare to ruin my plan, not only will the fox behind you die, but many of your descendants of the Southern Qiang will also die. Shen Yuan calmly made 3 requests, and Xiao Ye finally couldn't help but rush forward and tightly grabbed her neck. Princess. The attendants around were all frightened, and instinctively they were about to come forward and fight Xiao Ye away, but were stopped by Shen Yuan's gesture. What, do you think you can kill me? Xiao Ye ignored the bayonet pressing against his waist and abdomen, staring at Shen Yuan with a gloomy expression. We have surrendered, and now the people of Nanxiang and Beiyan are also the people of Beiyan. If you dare to make fun of them, I will definitely kill you. Xiao Ye was half a head taller than Shen Yuan, and Shen Yuan had to raise her eyes to see all the expressions on his face. Don't worry, as long as you obediently listen, no more innocent people will die for you. She only had one short sentence, but it was enough to make Xiao Ye vent all his strength. Yes, if it weren't for his insistence on running away that day, Li Sun wouldn't have died either. Xiao Ye's eyes slightly turned red as he struggled to release Shen Yuan and retreated to the side. I will fulfill all 3 of your demands. I hope you don't break your promise too. Shen Yuan turned around and picked up the whip from the table, strode over the iron cage used to hold the red fox in front of her. This princess never breaks her promise. After Shen Yuan left, Qing'er, who had been kneeling on the ground, dared to stand up and take a look at Xiao Ye's injuries. The wound that was previously bandaged has cracked again. Young Master Xiao, please wait here for a while, and I will go and call a doctor for you. Xiao Ye didn't speak, but lowered his body to pick up the red fox, which was half scared to death by Shen Yuan, from the ground. This red fox is extremely human, knowing that it was Xiao Ye who saved it. It immediately sobbed and crawled into his arms. Xiao Ye gently comforted the slightly trembling body of the red fox, and 2 rows of clear tears fell silently from his cheeks. What's the difference between his life and this red fox? They are just birds in someone else's cage. Since Shen Yuan gave Xiao Ye, the red fox, as promised, Xiao Ye has been obediently drinking medicine and eating. By the time Shen Yuan came to visit him at the fragrance selling academy in 10 days, his injuries had already healed by half and his complexion had improved significantly compared to before. I noticed that there weren't many clothes to change in your room, so I arranged for someone to make a few for you. See if you like them. Xiao Ye glanced up at the clothes on the table and then lowered his head to continue following the fur for the red fox in his arms. Shen Yuan has become accustomed to often ignoring what he says, not getting an answer or getting angry. Instead, he glanced at the red fox in his arms and asked. Did you give this fox a name? If not, I can give it a name. Xiao Ye fell silent for a moment. It's my fox, and what its name is also my business. I don't need the princess to worry. Shen Yuan snorted unhappily. Your fox, isn't it also a gift from this princess? Just call it Qishue. This princess likes this name. Xiao Ye didn't want to talk to her, so he just shut up and ignored her. Shen Yuan stayed at the fragrance-selling courtyard for a while, but when she saw that Xiao Ye was really uninterested, she gradually lost her patience. In a few days, someone will come to your door to customize your wedding dress. Remember to choose your own hairstyle. Abandoning this sentence, Shen Yuan walked out of the room. Xiao Ye waited until her footsteps disappeared before taking out the note hidden under the red fox and using a candle to burn it into ashes. The front hall of the princess mansion. After hearing what Shen Yuan said, Princess Qiyu Shen Yuntan almost choked to death on the dim sum in her mouth. Are you really planning to marry that crown prince of Nanxiang? Shen Yuan calmly put down the teacup in her hand. It's just a fake marriage. What I want is an obedient son.In.Law, not a real marriage. Shen Yuntan couldn't understand her train of thought. That Xiao Ye is the crown prince of the Southern Qiang. Now that the Southern Qiang has just been conquered by us, do you think he will really listen to you? Shen Yuan casually played with the jade bracelet on her wrist. If he doesn't listen to me, he will have to die. He is only concerned about avenging his parents and relatives, so he will definitely listen to me, even if he will pretend to be very obedient. Shen Yuntan took a deep breath and said, You have raised a venomous snake by your bedside. Yuan, you are really brave. What's scary about venomous snakes? Don't forget, I've been living in a snake cave since I was young, and everyone in the Shen royal family is even more terrifying than venomous snakes. Shen Yuntan remembered Shen Yuan's experiences over the years and fell into silence for a moment. Anyway, you better be careful. I heard that Xiao Ye is a rare genius of the Southern Qiang people in 100 years. He not only has unforgettable skills, but also is extremely strategic. Except for his poor health and weak martial arts skills, he is also very strong. You need to be careful when interacting with him in your daily life. Shen Yuan nodded in agreement, but had already planned in her heart. In a blink of an eye, we arrived at the day of our wedding. Although Xiao Ye's current identity is not worthy of Shen Yuan has always insisted on making him his son.In.Law, and it is difficult for the Prince of Northern Yen to say anything. Sitting high up, the King of Northern Yen couldn't help but frown as he looked at Xiao Ye, who was like a puppet and married Shen Yuan. The eunuch singing the salute on the side looked at the hour and shook the dust, raising his voice. Li Cheng. Send the son.In.Law into the bridal chamber. Usually, when getting married, the bride is sent into the bridal chamber, but when it comes to Shen Yuan, everything depends on her wishes. She said to send Xiao Ye into the bridal chamber, and the eunuch followed her advice. After all, no one present dared to question her. On the contrary, the courtiers watching the play on the side saw Xiao Ye's calm face, without the humiliating face they had anticipated, and couldn't help feeling bored. The King of Northern Yen stayed until Li Chengcheng returned to the palace to handle political affairs. Before leaving, he still felt uneasy and asked someone to call Shen Yuan over and give him another instruction. Since you insist on keeping him alive and wanting him to be your son.In.Law, you must keep an eye on him and not cause any trouble. Shen Yuan wore a bright red wedding dress and nodded calmly. Father, rest assured that my courtiers have a sense of propriety. The King of Northern Yen glared at her angrily and said, Is there a sense of propriety? Previously, I said that those royal children of the Southern Qiang people would be secretly executed, but you didn't listen. Now that the fugitive has not been found, do you still think you have a sense of propriety? Shen Yuan knew that the King of Northern Yen was still angry about the animal training game she had created, so she quickly stepped forward to please him and pinched his shoulder. Father, don't be angry. Anyway, Xiao Ye is now in the hands of my son. Those who have escaped will eventually appear. When the time comes, my son will catch them all and execute them on the spot. The King of Northern Yen pressed his brow wearily and said, Simply put, those people may not really jump into your trap. Chapter 4, But he looks good. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Shen Yuan smiled disapprovingly. As long as there is bait, there is no fear that the prey will not take the bait. The night slowly shrouded, and it was the princess who got married. The son.In.Law's identity was also sensitive. Except for the aristocratic young lady who usually befriended Shen Yuan, the courtiers scattered almost everywhere. On the dining table in the backyard pavilion, Miss Song Xing of the Protectorate General's mansion stood up and added some wine to Shen Yuan's glass, unable to help but complain in a low voice. I came all the way back from Liangqing to attend your wedding. Are you marrying such a fallen crown prince? Shen Yuan drank a bit too much alcohol tonight, and her usually sharp eyebrows and eyes couldn't help but be covered in a layer of mist. It's great to be the crown prince of a fallen country. Only the crown prince of a fallen country will not underestimate the power in my hands. Song Xing grew up with Shen Yuan from a young age, watching Shen Yuan bear various curses for the Shen royal family over the years, and finally end up in this broken situation. If he didn't feel sorry, it was impossible. The emperor really hurts you. If you really don't want this marriage, he won't make things difficult for you. Yuaner, you're living too tired. Marriage is such a big deal, you shouldn't have wronged yourself. Shen Yuan reached out to grab the wine jug and gave a somewhat ambiguous smile. It's not a grievance. Although Xiao Ye is just a crown prince who has lost his country, he looks pretty. Song Xing glared at her with a resentful expression. You are the most esteemed princess of Northern Yen. You don't have any kind of handsome man, but you have fallen in love with the appearance of a lowly Chang slave. Shen Yuan didn't explain either. After drinking half of the pot of wine with Song Xing, she slowly stood up and walked towards the Qinghua Tower. The maid guarding outside the building saw her appearance and quickly approached her, kneeling on the ground. As soon as Shen Yuan saw their nervous appearance, she knew that something must have happened to Xiao Ye again. Tell me, did he go on a hunger strike again or did he commit suicide again? The maid kneeling at the head quickly responded, as for the princess, the son.In.Law said that the marriage has been completed and there is no reason to continue staying at the Qinghua Tower. So, he will sell it back to the incense court on his own. Shen Yuan had a strong hangover just now, and now she feels dizzy and doesn't have much time to pay attention to where Xiao Ye sleeps at night. As long as he doesn't seek death or survival, let him do everything else. The maid breathed a deep sigh of relief upon hearing her words. Selling incense in the courtyard. Xiao Ye listened to the commotion coming from the next wall, his deep and cold eyes making it difficult to see clearly. You said she deliberately let you leave. The man kneeling behind him nodded hastily. I don't understand why she did this, but she did find us at the time and let us go. Xiao Ye touched the soft fur of the red fox in his arms and didn't speak for a long time. I see, you step back and don't let anyone notice. The shadow guard silently disappeared into the night, and the dim light of the lanterns hanging in the courtyard stretched and shortened Xiao Ye's slender figure. Xiao Ye stood alone in the darkness for a long time, until fine snow drifted up again in the dark night sky before walking towards the house. The next day, Shen Yuan woke up from a hangover and had a headache. She was even more annoyed than her headache, and as soon as she opened her eyes, she saw Xiao Yechu standing in front of her bed. Who let you in? Shen Yuan rubbed her head and sat up. Before her anger could erupt, she was left speechless by the teacup handed to her by Xiao Ye. Xiao Ye ignored Shen Yuan's stunned expression and spoke coldly with a handsome face. Today is the first day of our wedding, and according to the rules of your Northern Yen, this cup of tea to honor our wife should be served at an hour's notice. Respecting wife tea is a unique tea for princesses of the Northern Yen royal family. It is presented by the husband on the first day of their wedding, with the intention of respecting their wife for a lifetime and never abandoning her. Shen Yuan did not tell Xiao Ye about this matter, and at the moment, it should only be taught by the teaching grandmother from the palace. Set it aside, I'll drink it as soon as I wake up. Xiao Ye's posture of holding the tea cup remained unchanged, indicating that Shen Yuan would not stop drinking. Shen Yuan frowned slightly and impatiently glanced at Xiao Ye. You're looking for death, right? This palace asked you to put the broken tea in your hand aside. The maids standing inside the room were so frightened that they quickly lowered their heads when they saw this scene. Xiao Ye pursed his lips without saying a word, and after a while, he put the teacup aside and walked out. Shen Yuan looked at his departing figure and still felt a headache in anger. No one is allowed to let him in without the permission of this palace in the future. Xiao Ye's footsteps paused slightly as he left, his calm eyes unable to resist a hint of darkness. Shen Yuan woke up late today. After she finished grooming, Song Sheng and Shen Yuntan were already impatiently waiting in the front hall and rushed straight to her dormitory. Shen Yuntan was surprised when he saw Shen Yuan alone in the room and said, "I said Yuan heir, didn't you reconcile with that deceased crown prince last night?" Shen Yuan looked at the golden steps on his head in the bronze mirror. It's said to be a fake marriage, how could this princess reconcile with him? Song Sheng has been following his father and brother in the military camp for many years, and his temperament is similar to that of a man. When he heard Shen Yuan's words, he immediately hugged his arms and muttered unwillingly. "I'm sorry, you're just taking a vase and putting it back for display. It's just a matter of not using it." Shen Yuan looked up at her coldly, and Song Sheng immediately restrained his movements, covering his mouth and coughing softly. "I just feel that this deceased crown prince has no good intentions and is not worthy of being your son.In.Law. Even if it's a fake son.In.Law, he is not worthy." Shen Yuntan nodded in agreement. Shen Yuan stood up without much emotion and said, "He naturally doesn't deserve it. When I succeed, he won't be able to make any use of it. Then he will naturally be sent to where he should go." Qing'er, who stepped forward to lift the curtain, couldn't help but carefully glance at Xiao Ye in front of her after hearing her own princess's words. And Xiao Ye spoke with a calm expression, as if he had not heard what Shen Yuan had said. "Go tell her and say, I'm waiting for her at the entrance of the mansion. After speaking, he turned around alone and walked into the snowstorm. Qing'er looked at his desolate and lonely figure, sighed to herself, and then bowed into the room. Shen Yuan was sitting in the side dining hall having breakfast. Seeing her coming, his face showed a hint of impatience. "What's wrong with him?" Qing'er knelt respectfully on the ground, burying her head, and replied, "The son.In.Law said that on the first day of their wedding, they need to enter the ancestral hall for worship. They are now waiting at the entrance of the mansion." Shen Yuntan and Song Sheng, sitting on either side of Shen Yuan, had a somewhat intriguing expression upon hearing these words. Shen Yuan exhausted her patience and coldly placed the dishes in her hand on the table. "What I haven't said in the future is something that doesn't need to be done. Go ask him to go back to the Selling Incense Academy and stay well. Don't wander around without my permission." Qing'er responded with a trembling voice and quickly got up and retreated. After Qing'er left, Song Sheng reached out to take the spoon and added half a bowl of snow pigeon and green pear soup to Shen Yuan's bowl. "Don't get angry. If you really don't like him, there are zhuangzi everywhere in the suburbs of Beijing. Just send him anywhere and have someone keep an eye on him." Shen Yuan glanced inexplicably at the candlelight burning inside the room. "Just as I got married, I sent my son.In.Law away. I'm afraid those civil servants in the court will hold on to him again. Don't worry, I'll see what tricks he can play." Chapter 5. Just a Cat. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. When Shen Yuan finished breakfast, the frost and snow outside had already fallen heavily. Looking around, the glazed tiles on the porch wall were covered with snow. The close attendant Feng took a white velvet cloak and tied it for her. Seeing her staring at the snow in the courtyard, she couldn't help but ask in a low voice. "The princess wants Snowball." Snowball is a cat raised by Shen Yuan in his early years, named after its fat body and love to roll in the winter snow. Half a year ago, Snowball went missing at a banquet in the palace. When Shen Yuan found it, he found that someone had cut off his limbs and frozen to death in the dry well of the cold palace. Because of this, Shen Yuan fell seriously ill and woke up with an increasingly gloomy and unpredictable temperament. At present, Shen Yuan didn't show much expression when he heard Feng Qing's words, only spoke calmly. "Just a cat, if you die, then you die." As she spoke, she took the snow umbrella from the maid's hand and walked into the heavy snow with a heavy head. Feng Qing looked at her back and felt an uncontrollable heartache. The words Shen Yuan said just now were from when she cried uncontrollably when she found Snowball's body, and now the emperor is telling her. Nowadays, both inside and outside the Northern Yan dynasty, it is only because the king of Northern Yan highly favored Shen Yuan, that she was allowed to disregard human life and be arrogant and domineering. But who knows, Shen Yuan is just a shield against the cruel governance of the Northern Yan king. He will arrange for Shen Yuan to come forward and take action against those courtiers he hates and cannot directly deal with. When Shen Yuan's mother passed away, she was still young. However, the king of Northern Yan disregarded the grief of his young son and insisted that Shen Yuan, who was only 10 years old, come forward and personally eliminate the influence of his maternal family. Shen Yuan was slightly disobedient, ranging from cursing and insulting to severe fasting and confinement. A child who is only 10 years old was forced by him to look like he is now cold-faced, heartless, and ruthless. Today is the first day after the wedding, and there are still red silk fabrics hanging inside and outside the princess's mansion that have not been removed. There is a strong wind blowing, and those red silk fabrics spin in the wind, quickly returning to silence. Red and festive, but in Xiao Ye's eyes, he only felt sarcastic. Shen Yuan rode the snow and wind to the outside of the fragrance-selling courtyard, and the first thing she saw was the coldness that couldn't be hidden in Xiao Ye's eyes. She tugged at the corner of her mouth and spoke coldly. "You don't need to look, you're just staring a hole in these red silk. Our marriage has already been completed, and you can't escape the title of Shen Yuan's son.In.Law in your lifetime." Xiao Ye turned around when he heard the sound, and the red fox he was holding saw Shen Yuan. He was so frightened that he quickly plunged his head into his arms. "What are you doing here?" Shen Yuan raised her eyebrows lightly, her emotions looking somewhat ambiguous in her eyes. She walked up to Xiao Ye and poked the head of the red fox in his arms. Feeling the latter's frightened and trembling body, she smiled and spoke up. "What am I doing here? You are my princess's son.In.Law. Guess what I came to see you for?" Xiao Ye's face was a bit stiff. "You said, our marriage was just a scene." Shen Yuan took a step forward, her delicate jade fingers stained with cardamom gently brushing over the overlapping collar of Xiao Ye's chest. "I said it." "When did I say it?" Xiao Ye's body stiffened slightly due to her movements, and after a moment, he realized that he felt embarrassed and annoyed. "Shen Yuan. Don't bully others too much." Shen Yuan chuckled lightly and lifted the curtain in front of the door to walk inside. "Come in." Xiao Ye gritted his teeth to himself, thinking of his next plan. He held his breath and handed the red fox to Qing'er next to him, and followed Shen Yuan into the room. The dragon inside the house was burning brightly, and Shen Yuan took off her cloak and hung it aside before lazily sitting on a nearby chair and waving at Xiao Ye. "Come here." Xiao Ye stood still, his eyes growing colder as he watched. Shen Yuan felt that his dying face looked a bit cute. "What are you afraid of? Is it difficult for me to cut your Crown Prince Xiao into pieces of meat? I can't eat them one by one." Xiao Ye ignored her with a handsome face. Shen Yuan snorted in displeasure and stood up without hesitation, grabbing Xiao Ye's belt and pressing him into a chair. Shen Yuan has been practicing martial arts since childhood, and Xiao Ye is not her opponent. After struggling for a moment without success, she became so angry that her entire handsome face turned red. "Let go of me." Shen Yuan not only didn't let go, but also tore off his belt and threw it onto the ground on the side. Xiao Ye's eyes widened and he quickly grabbed the scattered clothes, his tongue almost unable to straighten in panic. You shameless. Shen Yuan half bent down, her sharp and beautiful eyes almost penetrating through Xiao Ye's panicked expression. Your people have come to see you, haven't they? Xiao Ye's body suddenly froze, and his brain couldn't react for a moment. Shen Yuan approached him and her slender jade hands slowly caressed his eyebrows and eyes. They all say that Crown Prince Xiao is naturally intelligent and unforgettable from a young age. He is a rare genius in 100 years. Unfortunately, geniuses don't seem to be very good at acting. Your poor acting skills today are enough for me to kill you 100 times. Do you believe it? Xiao Ye's breathing stopped and he didn't know how to react for a long time. Shen Yuan scared him for a while, then slowly stood up and let go of him when the timing was approaching. Don't play some useless tricks. Since you are my person now, I will naturally protect you from death. But if you don't listen and insist on seeking death, then don't blame my subordinates for being merciless. Xiao Ye's expression was somewhat disheveled, and his handsome face had a hint of annoyance. Why? Shen Yuan lowered her gaze and glanced lightly at him. What and why? Xiao Ye sat up, clutching his messy collar, with the red marks he had struggled to make on his fair collarbone. Why did you let them go? Shen Yuan didn't answer and asked, why can't I let them go? As she spoke, she approached Xiao Ye again and stared at him without moving for a moment. Or do you want me not to let them go? Her voice usually sounds cold, but now it exudes a hint of charm, just like the tale of that fairy, lazy yet seductive. Xiao Ambition jumped a bit fast, and in a moment of panic and displeasure, he didn't open his face and spoke abruptly. I didn't say that. Shen Yuan reached out and pinched his chin, forcing him to turn his head. It's just a few Qiang slaves. If you want to kill me, I'll let you go. If you just rely on this matter, you think I'm a good talker. I see you've made a mistake in your calculations. Xiao Ye suppressed his anger and remained silent. After hitting him, Shen Yuan lazily turned around and sat on the soft couch next to him, covered in a velvet blanket. Go change your clothes and follow me to a place later. Xiao Ye's fingers, clutching his clothes, tightened slightly. After a moment of silence, he returned to his usual cold and serene appearance. Half an hour later, a low-key carriage drove out from the back door of the princess mansion and headed towards the outskirts of Beijing. Xiao Ye didn't know where Shen Yuan was going with him, and thought it was useless to ask. He closed his eyes and didn't say anything, sitting on the side pretending to be dead. The carriage drove out of the imperial city and quickly turned onto an official road. The originally noisy human voices gradually drifted away, and only a few bird songs were occasionally heard coming from the deep jungle. Upon hearing the commotion, Xiao Ye couldn't help but open his eyes and lift the car curtain to take a look outside. Chapter 6. Winter Snow Banquet. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Looking around, I saw the scattered leaves of trees all over the mountains and fields, covered in frost and snow, each in a cold and unyielding manner, just like the dying soldiers. Xiao Ye visited Beiyan once when he was young. In a blink of an eye for several years, the scenery here remained beautiful, but his life had already turned upside down. You're already weak, how dare you blow a cold breeze and think your life is too long? Shen Yuan sat on the soft couch to the left of Xiao Ye, reading a book. The glazed lamp hanging on the wall of the car was hazy and illuminated her sharp eyebrows and eyes, making them much gentler. Upon hearing the commotion, Xiao Ye turned around and scanned the book she was holding in her hand. A few sentences were actually familiar with the content of the classic strategy, and she suddenly felt a sense of irony. The princess has a high status and can easily slay several heads with just a wave of her hand. It's really not worth reading this book. Shen Yuan recognized the sarcastic tone in his words, her red lips slightly curved, and her cold and beautiful eyes instantly became sharp. Xiao Ye, do you think our palace won't kill you for now? You're a bit reckless. Xiao Ye stared at her with unwavering determination. Is it true that Xiao was wrong? Or is it true that the princess has another plan? All appearances are just a cover-up. Shen Yuan raised her eyebrows slightly and her voice became colder and colder. You're really not afraid of death, she said as soon as she spoke. The atmosphere inside the car instantly dropped to freezing point, and at that moment the carriage suddenly came to a stop, with the driver's respectful voice ringing outside the blackout. Your Highness, the Huiguang Pavilion has arrived. Shen Yuan coldly glanced at Xiao Ye and, with a pretty face, threw the Jingshi Su in his hand onto the lower table next to him. Ignoring the frightened gaze of the maid waiting on the side, he lowered the curtain and got off the carriage on his own. Several palace maids who had been waiting outside the Huiguang Pavilion for a long time saw her appearance and quickly held up their snow umbrellas to greet her. Servants and maidservants have paid a visit to Royal Highness Princess. The winter snow banquet has been prepared, and the eldest prince, together with the relatives of the ministers, has been waiting at the banquet. Shen Yuan reached out to take the cloak that foam lightly covered her body, tied the straps, and listened to the footsteps coming from behind, speaking expressionlessly. Our palace takes the lead, and the son.In.Law's delicate and weak body inevitably cannot keep up with our palace's footsteps. Remember to support him more. The several palace maids who came to pick up Shen Yuan unconsciously lowered their heads when they heard this. According to the tradition of the northern Yan, when winter snow covers the mountains, a winter snow banquet will be held in the palace. If only the name of the banquet is heard, those who are not familiar with the royal family of northern Yan may think it is just a tasteless banquet. However, if someone unfortunately steps into this banquet, the dirt in it may be unforgettable for them for a lifetime. Xiao Ye followed Shen Yuan not far behind, feeling even more uneasy as he walked deeper into the Huiguang Pavilion. At first, there were no guards around the perimeter of the Huiguang Pavilion, but when they bypassed the green bamboo planted outside, several layers of soft armor and sword-wielding imperial guards rushed into sight. Apart from these imperial guards, the eunuchs who occasionally walk in the pavilions in front of the corridor carrying delicious food also look like trained family members. After walking for about half a pillar of incense, a luxurious and hidden pavilion in the mountains and forests finally appeared in front of everyone. Gu Yunzhou learned early in the morning that Shen Yuan would attend this banquet and waited outside the pavilion. Seeing her coming, he immediately welcomed her with a smile. I've been waiting for you for a long time, why did you come now? Shen Yuan stood in front of the door, lifting her hand to untie the cloak strap, and Gu Yunzhou skillfully reached out to take it and fold it for her. There is your favorite Qingchuan crispy steamed fish at the banquet. If you come later, you're afraid someone will finish it. Gu Yunzhou said it this way, but everyone present knows that the entire northern Yan is giving 180 courage to others, and no one dares to snatch things that Shen Yuan likes. Upon hearing Gu Yunzhou's words, Shen Yuan only lightly curled her lips. If you come so early and can't even protect my princess from the fish, then you don't need to be the grand priest. Gu Yunzhou's smile deepened and he said, it seems that in order to maintain his official position, the eyes of the officials in the future need to be brighter. The two chatted and laughed for a while, but as soon as Gu Yunzhou turned around, his face stiffened by Xiao Ye standing behind Shen Yuan. This is yesterday's big wedding. Xiao Ye clearly saw this person staring at him with a hostile expression in the banquet, but now he pretends not to know him. I really have no acting skills all over my body, some are all about my heart. Upon hearing Gu Yunzhou's doubts, Shen Yuan spoke calmly and said, the son.In.Law I just married yesterday, take him out to show his face, so as not to be killed by that person who doesn't have long eyes when I go out in the future. As soon as Shen Yuan finished speaking, the half-closed door of the pavilion was suddenly forcefully opened from inside. A young man, wearing an open robe and embracing his concubine, walked out of the room in a daze. Who dares to kill the person who killed Shen Yuan? Don't say they did, they just. Before Shen Mu could finish speaking, he was stunned by Xiao Ye's appearance in front of him. Setting aside his frail body, Xiao Ye did indeed have an extremely beautiful face. The eyebrows and eyes are cold and stern, but the facial lines are clean and soft, especially those eyes, which are dark and clear. Even if not speaking, they are very attractive. Shen Mu is usually very masculine. The waiter he brought this morning was accidentally killed by him at the banquet just now. Seeing Xiao Ye's face now, his heart immediately itches. Shen Yuan, your son.In.Law looks quite unique. As he spoke, Shen Mu reached out to touch Xiao Ye's face. A scream followed immediately. Shen Yuan lazily played with the blood-stained bayonet, squatting down to look at Shen Mu, who was holding his fingers and shouting loudly. The son.In.Law in this palace naturally has a unique taste, but unfortunately, only this taste can be tasted by this palace. Shen Mu was the 17th son of the king of Northern Yen. His birth mother was not favored in her early years, but in recent years, she gained some favor in front of the king of Northern Yen through various seductive drugs. According to seniority, Shen Mu is considered Shen Yuan's half-brother, but unfortunately, there are too many children for the king of Northern Yen. There are 20.4 princes alone, and 8 princesses. If each of them wants her to play some kind of brotherly and respectful trick, wouldn't she have to be exhausted to death? Shen Mu just got drunk and now he has been stabbed by Shen Yuan on his 5 fingers, and his mind has become much clearer. I'm joking, don't get too excited. At the palace banquet a few years ago, Shen Yuan killed and offended her courtiers in front of all the ministers. The bloody scene still frightened Shen Mu to the point of remembering it. He is now afraid that Shen Yuan, this madman, will not be satisfied and will kill him alive. Shen Yuan saw that the intimidation was excellent, and he didn't want to continue to stay here for a while. Take your people and immediately get out of the Huiguang pavilion. If it's half a quarter of an hour late, don't blame our palace for being impolite to you. Upon hearing his words, Shen Mu quickly covered his hands and got up before running outside. After teaching Shen Mu a lesson, Shen Yuan saw Xiao Ye standing dumbfounded on the back side and immediately spoke in displeasure. If you don't want to die, just follow closely. If you get lost, my palace won't have time to look for you everywhere. This pavilion may seem hidden from the outside, but when one truly enters it, they realize that the interior is spacious, with a luxurious layout. The banquet was divided into 2 sides. One side was the aristocratic children holding their concubines for drinking and entertainment, and the other side was the official ladies drinking and composing poetry with a screen hidden. Chapter 7. Feed Me. You are listening at novelfull.audio. As soon as Shen Yuan led Xiao Ye to appear, the originally noisy seating area instantly fell silent. The eldest prince Shen Zizi was talking to a young man when he noticed the commotion coming from the door and immediately spoke with a loud smile. But Yuan has arrived, please take your seat quickly. Shen Yuan ignored the prying or fearful gazes of the crowd and calmly led Xiao Ye into the upper right seat. Shen glanced at Xiao Ye sitting obediently beside her, and a deep meaning flashed through his eyes. I heard from my father that the jade coral plant in your mansion was accidentally damaged by the servants who were sweeping it a few days ago, so I specially asked someone to find another plant for you from Fuzhou. As he spoke, Shen made a gesture to the eunuch beside him. In no time, a coral covered in red cloth was carried from behind the table to Shen Yuan. Shen Yuan put down her silver chopsticks and glanced up at the object covered in red cloth in front of her. Big brother, you have a heart. It's just that this jade inlaid coral is too common. It's not a big pity if it's broken. You really don't need someone to search for it for me. Shen Yuan's words were merciless, and Shen's originally smiling face instantly froze. The young man Chu Pei, sitting beside Shen Zizi, frowned in displeasure upon hearing her words. At least the eldest prince has some kind intentions, how could the princess be so ungrateful? Shen Yuan raised her hand and placed a plate of grapes in front of Xiao Ye. While arranging for him to peel herself, she lazily replied to Chu Pei's questioning. General Chu has been living outside the pass for years, and I believe he has forgotten the rules of coming to this capital. According to the rules in the capital, Shen Yuan remained silent and the courtiers and their children were not allowed to speak too much without authorization. Chu Pei. You. Shen Zizi saw Chu Pei getting angry and quickly reached out to press down on his shoulder. This jade inlaid coral is not considered precious at all, and it's normal for a Yuan not to like it. I'm not careful today, but when I find other treasures the next day, I'll have someone deliver them to your house. Shen tried to smooth things over on her own, but Shen Yuan was busy teaching Xiao Ye, who had peeled her grapes in a mess, not even giving him a single penny during the entire process. And other people who are accustomed to this can only wish to bury their heads in wine glasses at this moment, so as not to let the city gate catch fire and harm their innocent group of pond fish. As soon as the interlude passed, musician Li Shishir quickly led the dancer forward to perform. The atmosphere at the banquet eased, but Shen Zizi's stiff expression remained unchanged. The plate of grapes in front of Xiao Ye is a tribute from the western regions, which is kept in ice by the ingredients department before being able to attend the winter banquet. This frozen grape is very cold and hard, and when peeled, it freezes to the point of numbness in one's fingertips. As soon as Xiao Ye peeled too, his beautiful black eyebrows furrowed deeply. Shen Yuan lazily leaned against the armrest of the chair with one hand supporting her chin, and looked at his bitter and resentful expression, only finding it amusing. Someone, bring a bowl of warm water to warm the husband's fingers. Xiao Ye raised his eyes upon hearing the sound, coincidentally meeting Shen Yuan's teasing gaze. He felt a bit regretful in his heart, but he suppressed his anger and handed the 2 peeled grapes to Shen Yuan. Shen Yuan lowered her eyes and scanned the lush green grapes in the bowl. Her red lips parted and she said, "Feed me." Xiao Ye paused as he peeled grapes and looked at Shen Yuan in disbelief. Shen Yuan raised her eyebrows slightly, with a hint of a smile hidden in her beautiful eyes. "What are you looking at?" "This palace wants you to feed me," she said. Xiao Ye gritted his teeth in a low voice, and his fingertips, which were frozen red, picked up a peeled grape and handed it to Shen Yuan's mouth. Shen Yuan opened her mouth with satisfaction and lightly bit the edge of the grape. Her warm tongue accidentally touched Xiao Ye's finger, which frightened him and quickly withdrew his hand. Shen Yuan couldn't help but chuckle softly as he looked at him with such a formidable appearance. With a smile on her side, she instantly caught the attention of many people at the table. Chu Shanshan led her maid to sit at the women's seat, and through the semi-transparent screen, she saw Xiao Ye sitting beside Shen Yuan. She couldn't help but slightly clenched the brocade handkerchief in her palm. For several years, I didn't expect that she would meet Xiao Ye again on such an occasion. The maid beside her saw that her face was not good, so she quickly spoke in a low voice, "Miss, I have inquired. Last night, Crown Prince Xiao did not reconcile with the princess. I think their marriage is really like what is rumored outside. Half a month ago, as soon as the news of Shen Yuan marrying the crown prince of the Southern Qiang Empire came out, there were many rumors in the capital that Shen Yuan was greedy for Xiao Ye's appearance and used his princess's power to force Xiao Ye to marry her." After listening to the maid's words, Chu Shanshan's ugly expression slightly softened. Shen Yuan has never taken human life seriously. A few days ago, he set up another animal training ground to slaughter the children of the Southern Qiang royal family. Xiao Ye must have hated her extremely. Maid. Who said it's not? I feel pitiful as I watch Crown Prince Xiao swallow his anger. Today's performance at the banquet was a 9-piece dance, with tight music and dense drum beats. Dressed in a cool outfit, the dancer spun and danced with the music, her slender waist twitching and swaying, making countless courtiers and their children's eyes straighten. Shen Yuan lazily sat in the seat with her head propped up, suddenly feeling a little drowsy for some reason. At this moment, the tight music suddenly lowered, and the originally charming expression of the dancer changed. Chi took out the hidden weapon hidden in her hair bun and killed Shen Yuan. Shen Yuan sat still, watching as the hidden weapon was about to attack her life gate. Sitting on the side, Xiao Ye suddenly grabbed the grape in front of her and threw it at the person in front of her. As soon as there was a commotion on his side, Shen Yuan suddenly woke up and grabbed the silver chopsticks on the table with her bare hands, directly inserting them into the eyes of the dancer who was rushing at the front. Ah! The screams of the dancer rang out, and the other assassins behind them not only did not retreat, but also showed even greater killing intent. Shen Yuan stood up with a cold and pretty face, kicking away the dancer who was lying on the table with her eyes covered in screams. Her sharp and beautiful eyes looked at the assassin in front of her with a hint of disdain. In previous years, those who assassinated our palace were still 7th grade dead warriors. Why did they switch to you this year? The assassin made a diving leap and the poisoned hidden weapon headed straight towards Shen Yuan's heart. To deal with such a witch like you, the few of us are enough. Shen Yuan dodged the hidden weapon attack sideways and coldly tugged at the corner of her mouth. Just rely on you. At the moment when her words fell, she suddenly changed her figure and launched a fierce attack on several assassins. After several confrontations, she completely gained the upper hand with one enemy against 10. At this moment, Shen Zizi, who was sitting in a high position, pretended to be anxious and spoke out, "Quickly pass on the imperial guards. Don't let the assassin harm Yuan." A few dozen meters outside the tower was guarded by the imperial guards, but at this distance, Shen Yuan had killed 6 people in a row, but they had not arrived yet. When Shen Yuan killed the 7th person, he did not choose to kill him with one blow. Instead, he protested and grabbed the assassin's throat, coldly looking at Shen Zizi. "Have you ever killed someone? If you haven't, my palace will teach you how to do it now." As she spoke, she lifted her hand and took off the golden hairpin from her bun. Facing Shen Zizi's panicked and frightened gaze, she slowly inserted it into the assassin's throat. In an instant, countless blood splattered out, directly dyeing half of her jade-white pretty face red, further highlighting her dark and cold eyes. Shen Zizi, who witnessed the scene with his own eyes, fell back into his chair as his legs softened. The slightly timid official lady on the side of the women's seat was even more frightened and fainted. Chapter 8. Abolish the title of prince. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Shen Yuan, expressionless, threw the dead assassin to the ground and glanced coldly at everyone at the table. "After so many years, why don't you have a long memory? This palace has said that anyone who dares to disobey this palace will only have one fate, and that is death." As soon as she finished speaking, the delayed arrival of the imperial guards finally rushed in from outside the pavilion, and the remaining 4 assassins looked a bit flustered when they saw the situation was not good. One of them saw Xiao Ye, who was intentionally protected by Shen Yuan, and suddenly came up with a plan. She pretended to attack Shen Yuan first, and took advantage of the moment when Shen Yuan made a move. The hidden weapon hidden in her sleeve flew out and directly shot at Xiao Ye, who was hiding behind Shen Yuan. Shen Yuan's reaction was quick. When she noticed something was wrong, her body suddenly took off and kicked the dark dart with her toes, causing the direction of the dart to shift. Xiao Ye was able to save his life, but his calf was still pierced by the dark dart. The assassin's move completely angered Shen Yuan. She drew out the sword that rushed into the waist of the imperial guards, cut off the assassin's right hand with her horizontal hand, and let out a loud shout. "Pass on the imperial physician." Her murderous aura was too strong, and even the imperial guards who wanted to come forward to help were somewhat afraid. Shen Zizi saw this and quickly spoke up. "First, send the son.In.Law to the back hall and pass it on to the imperial physician." Shen Yuan coldly tugged at the assassin's head, making a clean and sharp cut. The imperial guards on the side in front of her were preparing to move Xiao Ye, but she didn't even think about it and just kicked him over. "Without orders from our palace, who dares to touch him? Go and call the imperial physician here." Shen Zizi secretly clenched his hand and saw that Shen Yuan was now outnumbered, so he forced himself to remain calm and said, "Yuan, the assassin's dark dart is poisonous. You can't just focus on yourself and disregard the safety of your son.In.Law. Take your son.In.Law away quickly." Seeking death. Shen Yuan was furious and threw his long sword fiercely. Chu Pei, standing beside Shen Zizi, saw this and quickly reached out to pull him aside. At the moment they dodged, the long sword happened to pierce into the position where Shen Zizi had just stood. Princess. The commotion emanating from the pavilion finally caught the attention of the maids waiting outside. When Feng Qing arrived with the princess mansion shadow guard, he happened to encounter the only two remaining assassins who wanted to run away. She immediately drew out her double swords from her waist and struck off the head of one of the assassins with one blow. Shen Yuan lowered her body and glanced at Xiao Ye's injury. Seeing the situation, she spoke coldly, "Leave one alive." Feng Qing quickly stopped and handed a glance to shadow guard beside him. From a high position, Shen Zizi was still staring at the long sword nailed into the screen in shock, and Chu Pei beside him spoke with a solemn expression. "Your Highness, we cannot let those assassins leave any survivors." Shen reacted on his own and quickly climbed up from the ground with his arms propped up. However, before he could even speak, a long sword came from behind and draped over his neck. Shen Yuan's pretty face on the right side was still stained with the blood of the assassin, and her only pair of eyes were gloomy and terrifying. "Brother, why bother so much? You can't kill me, you don't know." Shen Zizi's body was stiff and terrifying, and when the eunuch in charge of serving him saw this, he was even more frightened, causing Wu Yangyang to kneel on the ground. "Ah! Ah Yuan, please calm down." Shen Yuan held the long sword with a slight force, and a blood mark appeared on Shen's neck. Chu Pei beside him couldn't sit still and quickly knelt down to the ground. "Your Royal Highness Princess, think again, the eldest prince is your elder brother. You really shouldn't." Before Chu Pei could finish speaking, a sword light flashed over his neck, causing him to feel a slight chill. Immediately after, he heard several screams of surprise. "Chu Pei! Big brother!" Chu Shanshan ran out from behind the screen of the women's seat with a pale complexion, and saw Chu Pei lying in a pool of blood. She felt her hands and feet cold, and her eyes turned black in waves. At this moment, Shen Zizi was going crazy in covering the wound on Chu Pei's neck, shouting angrily. "Tai! Where is Tai?" Shen Yuan withdrew her hand expressionlessly and looked down at the people in the hall, speaking coldly. The emperor had an order, and the eldest prince Shen formed a clique for personal gain, colluding with the courtier Chu Pei, with the intention of rebellion. He ordered the Chu family to be full, and male men over the age of 15 were immediately executed. The rest of them were sent to the education bureau as slaves. The eldest prince, Shen Zizi, immediately abolished the title of the prince and imprisoned him in heaven. He was not allowed to visit without the emperor's holy will. As soon as she finished speaking, Feng Qing took out the imperial edict that had been hidden in her sleeve earlier and handed it to Shen Zizi. "The eldest prince, please accept the order." Shen Zizi looked at the imperial edict in Feng Qing's hand in disbelief, suddenly changing his previous gentle and polite demeanor. With a calm and handsome face, he stood up and looked at Shen Yuan, throwing away Chu Pei's body. "Do you intend to rebel, Shen Yuan, by killing courtiers without authorization and attempting to imprison our king?" Shen Yuan looked back at him and felt that his current appearance was very pitiful. "I have said that all of this is the emperor's will." Shen Zizi grabbed the imperial edict in Feng Qing's hand and shook his hands to open it. When he saw the content inside clearly, he suddenly felt that the sky had collapsed. How could it be? Shen Yuan threw away the long sword in her hand, and the remaining light swept towards the imperial physician who was treating Xiao Ye, speaking without much emotion. "You secretly ordered Chu Pei to buy troops and hoard food, and your father had already known about it." Chu Pei had been stationed in Liangqing before, but he was suddenly recalled by his father. "Didn't you realize something was wrong?" Shen Zizi's legs softened and he could no longer support himself, falling directly onto the ground. Throughout the entire process, everyone kneeling in the hall was frightened and trembled all over. Chu Shanshan fainted in the dark as Shen Yuan read the imperial edict. It is night, dark clouds cover the moon, and the surroundings are still black. The princess's mansion was brightly lit with candles, and several imperial physicians knelt in front of Shen Yuan, trembling in response. The dark dart was coated with the strange poison of the western region's bloodthirsty goo, which became a goo with blood and was specifically designed to burrow into people's lungs. Fortunately, the son.In.Law was injured in the foot and treated in time, which saved him his life. Shen Yuan glanced at Xiao Ye, who was sleeping very restlessly with his eyes closed on the bed. "All right, I understand. You all step down now." After the imperial physician stepped down, Feng Qing lifted the door curtain and walked in from the outside, bowing down to hand over the examination script in his hand to Shen Yuan. "Your Highness, that assassin has already been recruited." Shen Yuan reached out to take the review script and opened it, then handed it back expressionlessly. "Send someone to the palace and present it to Father's Emperor." With this review, the military power in the hands of the Chu family can be more securely held by Father's Emperor. The Chu family is full of generals, and their prestige in the military is even that of the Prince of Northern Yen. In order to avoid the Chu family colluding with the prince and attempting to rebel, which is not accepted by the court officials, she was asked to risk herself as a princess and obtain evidence that Chu Pei and Shen intended to assassinate her. With this icing on the cake evidence, the king of Northern Yen can eliminate the Chu family as a thorn in his side without any hesitation. And facing so many assassins alone, the question of whether she would die has never been considered by the king of Northern Yen. Chapter 9. Do you think our palace dares not? You are listening at novelfull.audio. Shen Yuan lazily sat in front of the window, looking up at the pitch-black night sky. This sitting lasted all night. The next day, the news of the Chu family colluding with the prince and intending to rebel spread completely. In shock, the entire court was shocked. The incident of Shen Zi colluding with Chu Pei to send someone to assassinate Shen Yuan also became known to both the court and the public. Early in the morning, rewards from the palace flowed like water into the princess's mansion. In order to maintain his beloved character, the king of Northern Yen went to the princess's mansion after entering the morning court. "I heard that the son.In.Law was injured at the banquet yesterday. What is the current condition of the injury?" Shen Yuan sat under the king of Northern Yen, expressionless as he picked up a cup of tea next to his hand and took a sip. "The imperial physician has already treated it, it's not a big deal." The king of Northern Yen felt a slight displeasure in his heart as he looked at her, neither cold nor indifferent. A Southern Qiang lowly slave, if he can't be cured and dies, there's no need to worry too much about him. Shen Yuan paused, his hand holding the tea cup for a while before speaking up. "He is now my son.In.Law." The king of Northern Yen frowned in displeasure. "Why don't you want to marry the Grand Prince of the Left Liang and insist that he become your son.In.Law? I have a clear understanding in my heart. You are a smart child. You should know what kind of person I dislike the most." Shen Yuan calmly put down the teacup and said, "Since father knows why I want to marry him, he should know that I cannot let him be killed." The king of Northern Yen stared at her for a while before suddenly venting his airway. "Well, you are just like your mother. Since you want to keep him, you should keep him. But remember not to be sentimental, or don't blame your father for being cruel." Shen Yuan obediently nodded, and then the king of Northern Yen spoke with satisfaction. "You are already old this year, and it is inevitable that the princess's mansion is empty and lonely. I have asked the inner supervisor to select a few people to come and take care of your daily life." As soon as he finished speaking, the eunuch-in-chief Su Xing raised his hand and patted in the air. Then, 4 handsome and slender young men walked in quickly from the front hall door with their heads down. The king of Northern Yen said, "These are all descendants of court officials with innocent backgrounds. Although their appearance may not match that of the Southern Qiang lowly slave in your room, they are very gentle in character." Shen Yuan guessed the intention of the king of Northern Yen, feeling mocked in her heart, but did not show any emotion on her face. Since it was sent by my father, I will definitely treat them well. The king of Northern Yen said, if you have something you like, you can also be included in the house. You are my favorite daughter, and there is no need to learn from those women outside to guard a husband for a lifetime. Shen Yuan stood up obediently and responded obediently. Upon seeing this, the king of Northern Yen was satisfied and led the crowd away from the princess's mansion. As soon as the Northern Yen king left, the maid in charge of serving Xiao Ye came in and said that Xiao Ye had woken up. Upon hearing this, Shen Yuan stood up and saw the 4 attendants standing beside him in the remaining light, speaking expressionlessly. Go clean up those courtyards in Xiyuan and arrange for them to live in. Feng Qing said, yes. Selling Incense Academy, Xiao Ye had just woken up and his head was not very clear when he saw Shen Yuan, dressed in green clothes, strode in from the door. Shen Yuan walked up to him and first half bent down to carefully examine his face before lazily sitting in a nearby chair. Prince Xiao's body is also a bit weak. If you don't wake up today, our palace will have to spend money to make a coffin for you. It would be a great loss to think about it. Xiao Ye looked up at her and spoke without mercy. The princess eliminated 2 major troubles for the king of Northern Yen yesterday. I think there should be a lot of rewards in the palace today, just a coffin. It won't cost you much money. Shen Yuan raised her eyebrows in surprise and suddenly stood up with one hand pressing on the bedside. Her delicate and pretty face suddenly approached Xiao Ye. At the end of the day, there are many people who send money to our palace, and there are not many who dare to make our palace spend money. Xiao Ye did not flinch this time, but looked fearlessly into Shen Yuan's eyes. If the princess finds me wasting money, then throw me out of the princess's mansion now. Shen Yuanqing's eyes narrowed slightly and he said, do you think this palace dare not? Xiao Ye remained silent and looked at her without saying a word, his eyes teasing her no matter what they looked at. Shen Yuan's mind twitched slightly, and suddenly reached out to touch the position of his collar. Xiao Ye's hands, which were resting on the blanket, tightened slightly, trying not to move. He didn't hide, and Shen Yuan didn't hesitate either. He forcefully tugged at his collar and pulled it to the side, revealing half of Xiao Ye's fair skin hidden under his clothes. The maid waiting by the side immediately lowered her head and quietly retreated when she saw the situation. The dragon inside the house was burning brightly, and Xiao Ye's exposed skin was not cold in the air, but his body trembled slightly for some reason. Shen Yuan's sharp and beautiful eyes were like knives, scanning his outstanding face inch by inch. Xiao Ye, if you wish to seek revenge for your parents through this palace, I advise you to dispel this idea as soon as possible. After speaking, she let go of her hand and wanted to withdraw, but unexpectedly, Xiao Ye, who was sitting still, suddenly grabbed her wrist and pulled her back. Let go. Xiao Ye remained cold and handsome, his beautiful eyes fixed on Shen Yuan. They all say that the king of Northern Yen dotes on you very much, but how can I see that statement being very false? Shen Yuan, I am the crown prince of a fallen country, and you are just a slave of a prosperous country. The king of Northern Yen is specifically used as a slave to seize power. Bold. Shen Yuan suddenly made a move, and Xiao Ye, who was already physically weak, immediately fell to the side and spat out a big mouthful of blood. However, even so, the smile at the corner of his mouth did not diminish. Your Highness Royal Highness Princess doesn't need to be so angry. I'm just a dying man. If the princess gets angry because of me, the king of Beiyan will die of grief. Shen Yuan was furious and hastily stepped onto the bed, tightly gripping Xiao Ye's collar and lifting him up. Even if this palace is not prosperous, it is still a princess under one person and above 10,000 people. Can it be compared to you, a despicable son? Xiao Ye coughed up a mouthful of blood with a smile, and the crimson blood dripped down the corner of his mouth onto his chest. Soon, it dyed his snow-white shirt red in large patches. Under one person, above 10,000 people. Do you usually use this sentence to comfort yourself? Shen Yuan was so angry that his forehead was bulging with veins, and his cold and charming face gradually became ferocious. Xiao Ye, do you know what will happen if you offend this palace? Xiao Ye slapped her in the chest, and now he was in excruciating pain, but he still approached Shen Yuan calmly and spoke word by word. Thank you, Your Highness. Hurry up and take me to reunite with my parents. Shen Yuan endured for a while, then suddenly let go and threw him back onto the bed. Someone. Upon hearing the sound, Qing'er, who had left the room, walked in and quickly knelt down in fear when she saw the situation on the bed. Shen Yuan calmly turned over and got off the bed, without looking at Xiao Ye, who was gasping for breath on the bed, and spoke in a sharp voice. Go and summon the imperial physician to cure him well in this palace. After he recovers, he will be sent to the Qingyue Tower attendants' dormitory in this palace. Chapter 10. Don't touch it, even if it means taking my life. You are listening at Novel Full.Audio. Under Shen Yuan's gaze, Xiao Ye walked inside the curtain and lay down. Clenched his fists and stared straight at the ceiling. You'd better keep your word. Shen Yuan was infuriated and laughed, slowly strolling to the bedside. From beginning to end, he watched Xiao Ye, who was as close to death as ever, carefully. My gaze lingered for a long time, especially in my robust abdomen. Xiao Ye was furious and despondent. Have you seen enough? Shen Yuan couldn't help but burst out laughing, her crisp voice echoing indoors, accompanied by extremely superior eyebrows and eyes, exuding a mesmerizing beauty. Xiao Ye was stunned. Seemingly sensing something was amiss in the atmosphere, Shen Yuan immediately restrained. Replace it with a nonchalant smile. What's good about a fox? It can make the Crown Prince of Qiang achieve this level. Upon hearing this, Xiao Ye learned that he had been tricked and flipped over, but he didn't want to involve the wound on his foot and frowned in pain. If you dare to deceive me, I'll kill you. Upon hearing the seriousness in Xiao Ye's words, Shen Yuan took 2 steps forward. Curling her red lips, delicate fingertips wandered on Xiao Ye's snow-white skin. Keep going all the way up to the neck and tighten it suddenly. Xiao Ye, it seems that you haven't figured out the situation. This palace is your master. It's easier for me to let that stinky fox die than to crush an ant. Xiao Ye's breath had just become chaotic, and now his throat was choked, leaving him with no strength left. His voice was hoarse and he said, Don't touch it, even if you want my life. Intermittent words entered Shen Yuan's ears, and she was taken aback before shaking her hand. Stupid. Only a violent cough could be heard indoors, and Shen Yuan looked at Xiao Ye lying by the bed with slightly heavy eyebrows and eyes. It's not good, princess. The fox just scratched Yu Shijun and now he's taken away by Yu Shijun. Shen Yuan's eyebrows and eyes widened as she looked at the trembling maid kneeling on the ground. Where is the fox now? In the west garden, I heard that. The attendant is going to skin the fox and make a scarf. A severe cough came from inside the room, and Shen Yuan turned his eyes to see that Xiao Ye had already put on his clothes at some point. My eyes were filled with hatred. You've been teasing me from start to finish. Shen Yuan sneered and said, What if I didn't play with you? What if I played with you? Someone, let the imperial physician come and treat the son.In.Law well. Without the permission of this palace, you are not allowed to leave the Qingyue Tower. The palace maids below listened and quickly lowered their heads to say yes. Shen Yuan left the Qingyue Tower and headed straight for the west garden. Upon hearing the arrival of the princess, the 4 attendants immediately went out to welcome her and formed 2 rows in front of the door. I have heard of the arrival of the princess and have prepared a banquet. I kindly ask the princess to show her respect and take her seat. Shen Yuan looked up and saw the man speaking in a green robe, with long black hair cascading like a waterfall. Gentle temperament, with lowered eyebrows and eyes when speaking, and a respectful and humble attitude. Shen Yuan knew in her heart that this was the eldest son of the royal family, the eldest among the 4 courtiers. Famous boat. Since that's the case, take your seat. Shen Yuan's sharp gaze swept over the remaining 3 people and finally stopped at a man in purple. He is the one mentioned by the maid who stole the fox. The youngest of the Shangshu family, who is only 15 years old this year, is 1 year younger than her. At this moment, he is looking rebellious and unruly. Shen Yuan looked at him, slightly curling her lips, but her smile did not reach the bottom of her eyes. Princess, this is the latest grape offered by Daliang. How many grapes will I peel and taste for you? Shen Yuan looked over, but her mind was not focused on the banquet. These 4 were all gifted by the father, nominally serving as attendants for her. In fact, it is to use the reason of enriching the backyard to put eyeliner in her house. Since the last time she was a servant of the Qiang Kingdom, my father has been secretly probing her. This time, it is not guaranteed that she was instructed by her father. If she were to be careless, she would fall into an irreversible abyss. Raising land, Yu Guang swept over Yu Shijun. Shen Yuan lifted her red lips lightly and said, I have long heard that Yu Shijun is intelligent and skilled in wielding swords. Why not come and sing a song to fully enjoy yourself? Upon hearing this, Yu Shijun stood up for a moment. Just as he was about to speak, he was cleverly resolved by Wenzhou. Since the princess wants to watch the sword dance, why don't you prepare quickly? Don't delay. Yu was about to retort when he heard that the boat had turned a color towards him. Instantly understood, stepped forward to report. The princess wants to see, Rong Yu will go down first to prepare. There is an arrogant expression between the eyebrows and eyes. After speaking, without waiting for Shen Yuan to open her mouth, she turned around and wanted to walk outside. Shen Yuan watched the small movements between them with great interest, and saw that Yu was only half a step away from leaving the door. Her red lips lightly parted. Stop. The atmosphere at the banquet instantly solidified, and the boots that Yu extended were still in mid-air, not falling. I happen to bring a sword to this palace, so Yu Shijun can use these 2 swords. As she spoke, a maid had already brought a sword to her hand. Yu clenched her fists and grabbed the sword, then turned around and approached Shen Yuan's door. At the banquet, the other 3 attendants were all startled and stopped drinking from Yu. But I saw that he still had no stopping momentum. The blade of the sword was only a fraction of an inch away, capable of stopping in front of Shen Yuan. Shen Yuan raised her bare hand, removed the dagger in front of her, and looked at Yu, who was stunned. Yu Shijun's swordsmanship is indeed good, but remember next time that the sword has no eyes, so be careful. The sword in Yu's hand fell to the ground with a crisp sound. Shen Yuan still sat down, elegantly tasting the grapes placed in the jade plate. Yu's skills are not proficient, and he did not grasp the right balance for a while. I hope the princess can make amends. Wenzhou is willing to punish him on his behalf. Shen Yuan glanced sideways and took a bite of the crystal-clear grape flesh. Is it true that my skills are not proficient, or for some other reason, I have a sense of propriety in my heart? However, since you have entered my princess's mansion, you will never go out except for death in this life. Shen Yuan scanned the 4 people one by one, only to see that except for Wenzhou, the other 3 had an ugly face. With a sneer, he said, I'm sure you've all heard of my methods before. There's only one more thing left. Before taking action, think carefully about your identity so that you don't go the wrong way. After speaking, Shen Yuan took the handkerchief sent by the maid and cleared her hands. Wave your sleeves and leave the seat. For a moment, only 4 attendants remained in the garden. Yu has never regained his senses to this day. As he watched Shen Yuan leave, a hint of fear flashed in his eyes. Lifting his trembling left hand, a painful expression appeared on his face. How about it? Yu looked at Wenzhou and said, my wrist was broken by her pick. Shen Yuan returned to the Qingyue tower only to realize that she was exhausted. And inside the Qingyue building, there was still a big problem at that time. Just as I entered the building, I heard the maidservants urging me hard. "Fuma, please have a drink. If the princess comes back and sees you so weak, she will definitely cut off my limbs." After speaking, there was a burst of sobs inside the building. "Get out." A 10,000 gold official kiln celadone cup was smashed out and almost landed on Shen Yuan's face. Shen Yuan's face suddenly darkened. Stepping in, Xiao Ye's face turned pale, even paler than before. Shen Yuan only felt her temples throbbing. "If you want to die, I'll take you as soon as possible."